he looks over at me and he's like, this part of the river looks really familiar. And he kind of like takes like 2 Mississippi beat and he's like, I know, right over there was where I saw a dead body.
All right, welcome to another episode of the Real Deal Landman Show. We are very pleased and honored to have with us today Jake Anderson. We're going to get to him in a minute, learn about his story and some of the incredible things that he has been able to work on. But first, I have to ask Mr. Hopkins about something. I don't remember what the context of it was or if there was even any context, but at random, I received this text message from Drew of his days of catfish noodling. Jake, do you know what noodling is?
So I think I do because I have a pretty good friend from Louisiana. Is that where you like put the big glove on and you've got the stuff in your hand when you're catfishing on like where it like chomps your hand, or is that a different
This is
thing?
very close. Everything that you're saying is correct except minus the glove.
Except Drew doesn't use the glove.
Oh, you just
You
go
don't.
straight to the old-fashioned hand. Okay.
Now, I was chastised the first time that I did it because I didn't want to lose one of these good digits.
100%.
And so the first time I went there, I used gardening gloves from Lowe's. And the guys that I was with acted like this was the biggest just slap in the face to the sport. And it was ostracized, like it was terrible. No, I've been noodling now, and it's one of those things where about this time of year, late May, all of June, right before the 4th of July, that's the end of it. But noodling in Oklahoma is a pretty big deal. And I mean, it's something that I've been doing now probably 15 years and still have all the fingers, all the toes. Go with a very select group of very well-versed hand fishermen.
Nice.
To a couple secret locations that they wouldn't even want me telling this much about it, to be incredibly honest. But yeah, we go every year, very close to Oklahoma City. We always do pretty good catfish damage, bluegill, channel cats. I mean, just a little bit of everything. And it's a blast. It's one of my favorite times of year, honestly.
I love it. How big was that one in the picture you sent?
The biggest one I've ever got was 48 pounds.
I mean, it looked photoshopped.
It does. And in the years of AI that we're in now, first off, like I take a couple steps back on it, because the first thing is whenever I show people that picture, I did not have all the gray in my beard. And so it's like 10, 15 years ago. And they're like, okay, first off, we know this is absolutely an incorrect photo because you look nothing like that anymore. And then the second thing, it does have like a little air of AI-ishness to it. And so people look at it and especially now, nobody trusts anything, right? Like none of us trust any photo that we see somebody else very happy about. You're like, no, I don't think so. So it's definitely one that I have to explain and go back and show the timestamp and be able to have somebody on retainer that I can call to prove it and show a different angle or something of it. But we've enjoyed it a lot. Those were good days. They continue to be reasons that we want to go out there. I mean, it's just the fisherman's mindset, right? You always want to go back because of the one that you caught last year. So it's a heck of a lot of fun.
That's a lot of fun.
Do you bait them somehow, or do you just wiggle your finger and pretend it's a worm? Like,
this is your bait, Jared.
That's it?
I'm showing you the bait right now. So without absolutely taking over this episode and talking about this for the next 3 hours, because I really want to, but Jake is way more interesting than me. I guarantee it.
I don't think so.
So you're in like waist deep to neck deep water is what we do. There are concrete slabs that are of different angles that create like natural pockets. And so right in May and June, that's whenever the catfish they're laying eggs and they're having their little catfish babies. And so they are in the still water that's underneath these concrete like slabs. And so you can just reach under there. If they are just laying there on top of the eggs, if they've already had their eggs, they're very aggressive. If they haven't had their eggs, they are not very aggressive and they're just breathing. And so for anybody watching on YouTube, I am opening and closing my hand like a fish mouth. For anybody listening in, just close your eyes and try to visualize. But you can reach your hand in, and as you're going in, it's just breathing underwater, and you can feel it, and you just start going in their mouth. And the second that you get in far enough, You can latch down. You can do one or two things. You can latch down on their bottom jaw, but you've got to have a firm grip. Like you've got to have a firm grip, and that is like 70% effective, because once they start rolling, it could be over. Or you go all the way into a gill, and if you can grab through the gills, that's whenever you can pull out. That's 100%. Like they're not getting away from that. That's all if they're being very non-aggressive. If they're on eggs, they're going to be real aggressive. And then whenever you're going in, the second your hand's in, then they're hitting it and they're trying to bite. Teeth are more like sandpaper, and so you can get really like cut up and everything. But it's definitely the only thing at 44, 45-ish that I want. It's the only adrenaline that I want once or twice per year. After that, why take risk, right? I mean, me drinking a diet soda is, why are we taking risk at this point in our life? So it's fun. It's something that I really do like. I will, when we do upcoming episodes, and this is the year that I do lose a finger, I know it will be how Jairus opens every show is the story of how I do lose a finger. But I mean, we've been lucky this far, and it provides. I always wanted to do a company retreat noodling event with whatever company I was with. I thought that would be like, some very high-end companies. Jake, I'm sure you guys, PVKs, probably take people out in the Gulf and do like marlin fishing or something like that, or, out on the West Coast. In Oklahoma, we don't have marlin fishing. So the next best thing, and I truly mean the next best thing, is bluegill catfish.
This is insane. I honestly, I thought you'd say, yeah, it's a picture of me with a fish. I did not know you were this passionate about it, and it would turn into this long of a dissertation.
This is, I'm telling you, unfortunately, it can go longer. Joe Rogan or any of the other podcasts would have absolutely nothing on our ratings, because these guys are characters, and I can't keep up with them. Like it's absolutely amazing. They've been doing it for far too long, and they're hilarious. I'll end it with the shortest version of the story is we're out in the river and it's calm. And the water's the sun is going down. It's a beautiful Oklahoma sunset. Beautiful. There's trees over each side. And we're out in the middle of nowhere close to Oklahoma City, where you feel like you're away from the city. And it's just really beautiful. And it's like going in. So I don't want to bore you all with the schematics of this, but I'm sitting there blocking. And so nothing can get out my side. And the guy that I'm with, he looks over at me and he's like, this part of the river looks really familiar. And he kind of like takes like two Mississippi beat, and he's like, I know, right over there was where I saw a dead body. And then he holds his breath and he slowly goes underwater to try to get the fish. And it's really something to be alone with your thoughts whenever the guy that, now is underwater for however long, talking about the dead body that he saw up on the bank. It's fishing at its finest, is what I want to tell you.
And in case you've never joined us before, last year, about this time, we did an episode about Drew's management of an underground semi-professional wrestling ring, or wrestling league. So make sure you check that one out as well. But let's get on to somebody else.
Let's talk to some real version of his noodling story as well.
Yes.
I'll give the very summary, but your note about your buddies being characters, that's exactly his. His was when he was growing up in Louisiana, and he grew up in, not New Orleans, Louisiana, let's call it. So, a little more out in the old timers, and he was a Boy Scout essentially. And so they would do like their camping things, and this one like old timer Boy Scout leader type of guy who'd been around the group forever, was probably like 70. They'd do these campouts and they'd be cooking dinner, and they would always, bring whatever the dinner is. But then all of a sudden, this old timer, he would just strip down to his underwear, throw in a massive thing of chewing tobacco, go stand in the river for about 30 seconds, rip out a big old catfish, spit on the ground, be like, I got my dinner, boys. And he wouldn't give anyone that was just his own dinner. Skin it up right there, had his own campfire, and this guy was just, sopping wet in his underwear, about 70 years old, cooking his own catfish, and was like, if you want your own...
I don't know how often he visits Oklahoma, but I'm pretty sure I fish with him every year. I'm like, you're describing Terry is what you're doing. You're absolutely describing Terry.
30 years from now, Drew is going to be in his underwear standing in the river, and he's going to pause and go, I've heard this story before.
Why does this sound so familiar?
Right? Yeah.
Oh my gosh. No, I won't be allowed anywhere near Boy Scouts. Yeah. Well, Jake, we are so happy. Number one, we're so happy you're on the show with us today. What we kind of do with any of this is just be able to give like a good spotlight on who you are, and we want people to be able to get to know you. So for the Real Deal Landman Show, give us the rundown of like how you got to where you are now. So where'd you come from? What was your background? What'd you study? All the fun stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first off, again, thanks so much for having me. Really excited to be here. I've followed you guys for a bit from a distance. Jarvis and I go, several years back now at this point. But yeah, to introduce myself to the audience, my name is Jake Anderson. I am the head of business over at PBK. So basically, my background, I originally founded a company called Anderson Optimization. And we were a software company that we started in the renewable space, really focused on site selection. So helping renewable developers find ideal land for solar development primarily, but also wind, batteries, et cetera. And so my co-founder and I, he comes from an energy background, and we were starting to talk to a lot of companies in the space back in, call it 2016, 17, and just wanted to kind of start a software company in that space. And we just kept hearing from company after company when we'd say, what's hard? They'd all say, site selection. We just cannot find any good land. There's this huge need for solar, but we just can't find any land. It needs to be nearby the grid. We got to get away from all these constraints. So put our heads together, built out a platform that really automates that entire process, provides all the relevant data, and we can get more into it. And then, we went to market with that and call it like spring of 18 or so. And then from there, over the past 5 years to 2023, we really built that out in the renewable space to kind of become the de facto site selection software in the industry. And then at that time is roughly when we really wanted to continue expanding out those capabilities, because as land became more and more used on these renewable projects, but also too, we were getting a lot of interest, data centers, again, wind and some of these other capabilities. We wanted to really expand. And in 2023, we were acquired and actually merged with the company PBK, which is where I now am. And they basically, in the value chain of renewables, we were really good in Anderson at finding the land, figuring out where to build solar farms. And they basically make the software that creates the entire blueprint, the design, the layout for all of that software. We said, hey, we find the land, they do all the design, let's join forces. So we completed that acquisition deal here in about June of 2023. So coming up on 3 years now, which is wild. It's already been almost 3 years. And then, we
Goes
really
fast.
kind of become the true end-to-end development platform. Within PBK, I basically am the general manager, kind of president of what we now call the Prospect business unit, which is essentially the old Anderson site selection software, set the overall business plan, strategy, et cetera. Where a lot of our focus is these days, and I think it'll be very timely as we talk today, is in this data center realm, the land and also the power side. And, really just in the 20 teens when we were coming up, it was so much renewables and the generation side only. But now you have these big, large load projects with AI and everything there. So spending a lot of time thinking about that. And then, prior to starting the company, I come from a corporate finance, Fortune 500 background. Knew I always wanted to start my own company, but figured every company needs finance. So worked at the big corporate for a while, got my reps, and then, kind of rest is history. So it's been fun here, kind of really talking land and site selection here for now, 8 years almost, which is, it makes me feel old sometimes we've been doing this for a little while now.
It moves at a pretty good clip for sure. Like I always think so. I mean, the Real Deal Landman Show, we've got a very heavy landman audience. And most of the time we're talking like upstream oil and gas. And so one of the things that I always like is every single day we're learning stuff that we don't have a good grasp on. And solar and wind is something that I'm so interested in with like the renewable space, site selection, being able to see what is viable land that can be used by these different projects. With the oil and gas world, we always talk about like relationship driven of going out and being able to find places to lease. How much is site selection for solar? How much is that based on relationship, or is it leaning more towards the data world now?
It's a great question. And then the way I'm trying to think the best way to answer, it's honestly a mix of both. And it's been an interesting evolution when we came on the scene. So when we first came on the scene was, call it, right at the back end of companies saying like, hey, if we're just going on purely relationships, we're going to run into some level of a bottleneck. But before we came on the scene, there was no process to really say, like, is this good land or bad land? So what was happening is you had these companies coming in and they'd say, hey, we know we want to target this county. And they would just like spray every single person in that county with a mailer and cold calls and cold emails and knocking on doors. And like, you guys know the landman game. When you're in some of these rural counties, everyone knows everywhere. And
Yeah.
if there's some stranger in a suit just knocking on doors trying to sell this new technology that people don't know, like it burned a lot of folks, especially when it was, some companies that maybe didn't have the scale they were maybe. So we kind of came in right when there was somewhat of this negative local sentiment. And so where we really came in the scene and when we talked to these companies was what they were saying is it's like, we need to build relationships because at the end of the day, if you don't have the relationship, it all goes sideways because it's, you're getting into business for 20, 30 years when you sign these leases. But at the same time, you can't just go try to make friends with everyone and sell them on this idea that you can make them rich on putting a solar farm on their land because there's so many things, whether it's the grid, whether it's the land, whether it's the hazards, the slope, there's so many things about whether a site is good or not, that if you're not filtering that on the front end, you're going to lose your credibility really quickly. And that was kind of our big aha moment. So when we were talking to companies is because it was so manual, they would grab a couple different data sets, things like flood hazards, where are substations, which is kind of where you plug your solar farm in, where are there big hills, but they had no systematic way to do it. So they were all sort of shooting from the hip. So what we did was basically found not just those couple people were using, but basically the very full laundry list of every potential land hazard you could have. So I think, when we started, we probably had 8 or 10, but now we've got like 50 different land parameters that you can automatically look for across hundreds and hundreds of sites. So we basically tried to give this screening to say, hey, here is out of these 500 or 5,000 you looked at, here's the 50 that actually have a chance. And here are who these 50 people are. Go try to build a relationship with them rather than, burning your credibility by spending all this time on sites and people that don't actually have a viable thing, because that can just, again, very quickly burn your credibility. Because if you don't have the relationship, it all goes sideways. But you can't build a relationship if you're just going and telling someone you can put a solar farm on their property and they say, I have 2 acres and half of it is, already for certain crops X, Y, or Z, or,
Right.
a forest, whatever it may be. So it's a very delicate balance, but we tried to give a better filter on the front end.
That's interesting.
Mentioned that you started doing this late 2010s, and obviously that was a huge time in the United States for renewable backings. We had the IRA that was happening. People were really excited. It seems like some of that sentiment has pulled back a little bit. Has the pullback from renewables impacted the business, or is there a new frontier or new use case that people are utilizing your services for?
Yeah, it's a great question. So to speak to kind of those one by one. So in terms of the renewables, what really ended up happening is, there's the incentives piece, but when, you go talk to the utility folks, and this is where I always kind of chuckle a little bit. One of the very first conferences, and it's still, true to this day, there was a big utility person and it was called when we were first starting. And it was, renewables were making this growth and the what became somewhat of a political conversation of like, oh, oil and gas or solar. But this utility person put it the best. He was like, I just want the cheapest electricity I can possibly get. My job is to make my ratepayers bill cheap. Like
Yeah.
an electron's an electron. At the time and generally like where it is right now, solar is the cheapest per electron. It has dispatchability issues as well. So I would say like even without the incentives, that definitely throws things for a loop. But what really has thrown generation and everything into a loop, whether it's renewables, oil and gas, is the grid at large, because companies such as ourselves, PBKs, like we all came on the scene to create services to make this planning process so much easier. All of a sudden, they can only push through at a certain rate, but new projects can get added to what's called the interconnection queue or this wait list so much faster. The grid kind of got clogged up. But then, so what's really been kind of taking off for us over the past 12, 18 months, where we've been talking to a lot of companies, and again, just the tailwinds of every industry, is the AI and the data center boom. I
Hmm.
think a lot of these energy companies that are traditionally on the generation side doing solar farms, oil and gas, whatever it may be, they're all now looking on the load side because there's such a demand for these data centers. So over the past, 2 years, and I'd say we kind of went to market with our initial offerings in the data center space, call it 18 months ago. And then over the past 18, we've really scaled up and are now supporting companies of all shapes and sizes in that space, call it the long-term true data, capital D data center companies. A lot of these energy companies that know energy infrastructure really well, but since the grid is clogged, they're now starting to try to figure out that game. And then you have your, what I would call your just tech companies that are saying, we're just going to try to do this in house. And it's interesting because each one of those kind of knows one sliver of the data center game, but none of them really have that perfect all encompassing picture. And we've been really trying to help them all out with that.
Does the service or the software, does it react? Because I guess on the renewable side, you were trying to help people put power into the grid. Now you're trying to help people take power out of it. Does that change your offerings, or are people more or less looking at the same parameters still?
A great question. And so the way we describe it is kind of, we basically create an engine where what you are looking for, you kind of tell the system. And then our system is designed inherently to be pretty use case agnostic, where you tell it what you need, and then it pulls out your relevant opportunities based upon those inputs, which is why when we started, solar was definitely our base, but we had storage customers. We even had some, transmission line customers. We had some, battery customers. The platform and the service operates the same, but the way that companies look at it is different. I can kind of go into a couple examples there, but one of the biggest learnings I would say that's been a shock is how similar data centers operate like an energy asset more than a commercial real estate asset. So when I started, I hear data centers. I'm like, yeah, it's probably similar to a factory, as an example. It's a big old building, and it's got some equipment in it, and you just kind of build this building. So we thought it was going to be a pretty just, find some land, and that's where it was. But because of the scale of these data centers, like they're more closely related to an energy asset, but pulling energy off. Because to help your audience who might not be energy folks, so you hear about these like 500 megawatt data centers in the news from like an AI, or like a Facebook or a Google. To like put that in perspective, like 500 megawatts is the entire amount of energy as the city of Denver for a year. So
Holy cow.
yeah, like a monstrous amount of energy. So it's a little different than just making a building. And in the same way, if you think about your house, if you plug in your toaster and your washing machine and then maybe a hair dryer, that can trip a breaker. Exact same thing happens on the electricity grid. So a big part of what we do, and as we grew in the renewable space, was not just, hey, here's a good piece of land that's flat and dry and no woods on it. It was, well, we need to get this energy into the grid. And for data centers, we need to get the energy out of the grid without breaking the whole thing. And that gets into this, what's called capacity. And this is every data center company you talk to right now. The big thing they talk about is, where is power? That's the big bottleneck as much as land. And interestingly, the exact modeling you do for the generation side is the exact same modeling you do for the load side. You just kind of flip it. That's not entirely technically correct, but for, without going down the science rabbit hole, it's that same type of thing. And then the third piece that's really the most different piece for, data centers versus the renewable space or any energy asset is what they call connectivity. And it's kind of this triangle. And connectivity is, you usually be by fiber, internet exchange points, and basically get this data center plugged into the internet, so all of that data and the computation can be used by it. And so that's what we really tried to do, is in our platform, bring all the land data that we've always had, take our power data that used to be all about generation, where can I put big generation, to now, where can I put big load? And then the biggest add we had to really do was getting all of this stuff about the connectivity, the fiber, but all of the interactions of, hey, I want to find a piece of land with all of these criteria that's nearby these items, almost identical. So I think it's been a pretty eye-opening experience for us, that despite being the other side of the power table, it's actually a pretty similar process.
That's really interesting.
That was a long-winded.
No, it's fantastic.
That is super interesting. And so like I always hear about, and like we are fortunate enough to talk to people that are involved with like leasing solar and everything. I've heard multiple people say sometimes they can get a great section of land, but because it doesn't have any grid access, like that can absolutely stall like a project. So does the software that you have, is that helping identify, hey, this is close enough to like grid access, and that is helping identify this as a prime location to be able to, explore out?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
That's a perfect example where, and so like in very simple terms, kind of the way to think of like a very basic user experience of our platform is, I'm a data center developer and I'd say, I want to find a grid interconnection point where I can put 200 megawatts of power. So basically pull that much energy. I also too, with that 200 megawatts power, because the grid, like I talked about, is in so much flux right now, it's being upgraded all the time. So the same way we use the analogy of like at your house, if you trip a circuit breaker, you might need an electrician to like make a bigger circuit so you can get all that power. Electricity grid works on the same way. And if I break it, I pay for it. So, I want to put 200 megawatts. Where can I do that for less than $50 million? And I also then want to find land that's within a mile of that is flat, that's dry, that's not in forested areas, that I'm not going to have any critical habitats issues, kind of factoring that. And then the third piece is I also need to be by a fiber line that has internet exchange points of X, Y, or Z. I also need to make sure then on that side that potentially there might be a pipeline because sometimes these are getting some natural gas type of power. And you basically just hit go, and our system will then just automatically spit out every option of that and say on each of these sites, who owns it, how do you contact them, if I have this 100 acres, where specifically is the buildable zone? And yeah, basically you hit go and it tells you all of that automatically. So it absolutely takes the grid side and tries to mirror it with that land side to give that nice end-to-end process.
That's really cool.
So yeah, we've tried hard to, really do it. And that's a big thing we say. It's like, when we started this, it's one of our, we say it in almost every sales call. It's like when we started, everyone's like, oh, I need this data. Like, where's fiber? I need capacity data. But like, data's data, but it's like all that manual work of triangulating that is the real bottleneck. So we always say It's like data's the foot in the door. It's much more of a workflow problem really than a data problem. That's where we really try to invest our time.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I remember as a user in the early days of Anderson optimization, I was astonished at not only how much information it had, but how easy it was to use. Like there wasn't really a learning curve. Like here are your data. This is, draw a map or collect or pick an area and it'll tell you everything that you wanted to know about that area. And I was always really impressed and appreciative of just the usability of the overall platform. But I did want to ask, so you mentioned the 500 megawatts, and there's a lot of news and a lot of headlines that people see about data centers today. Some of this facts and figures that we read about or hear about just seem so enormous that there's no way they could be true. So educate us a little bit. Are these numbers true? And what are some of the facts and stats that would maybe just shock people?
Yeah. So on the true, like, I think I want to caveat everything I'm about to say with like, I think we're all entering unprecedented territory, as we all know. So, anyone who tries to give an answer of like, this is true is just being disingenuous about the degree they know. So I'm going to caveat all of my thoughts on this topic at the top. But I think, if I'm upfront, I think some of these numbers of the scale that I see definitely just don't make sense. Like I've seen, some of these headlines from various CEOs and that's like, oh yeah, we're just going to put up like a couple gigawatts. And I'm just like, if you know anything about the energy grid, like you can't just spin up a couple gigawatts either direction without literally years and years and years of fortifying the infrastructure to be able to handle that type of thing. So even if you could put up those large numbers, the time scale of when that would come is just not accurate to the way that they're saying. So I think this goes to the whole, it's interesting because like these are really energy assets as much as they're being mostly talked about in a tech space. And I think what's been interesting about the data center groups that we talk to is there's kind of three profiles and they all have things they really know and things they don't. The legacy data center companies really know how data centers operate, how to build them, what their sizes should be. But they're not necessarily what I'd call like energy folks. So when they say like, oh yeah, I'm going to throw up a gig, and we're like, do you have $100 million to fix the grid? Because that's part of it. It's like, wait, how does that work? You go talk to an energy company and they can say, I really know I got to know on the grid, it's et cetera, et cetera. I'm like, well, are you thinking about the connectivity, how to get to the fiber, et cetera? And they'll say, no, tell me about that. So I think you see these numbers and I think everyone has good intent with them, but I think just everyone has some blinders of what they are. And long way of saying I do have some skepticism about this. Either one of the two things has to change. The time scale of some of these very big numbers, it's going to just take a lot longer than the initial off the cuff times you hear, or the scale has to come down to be more realistic because just it's such a intense change to the grid that would be a lot and create some risk there.
That's interesting.
But yeah, so like I said, I think the one that always helps, we use it in training of just like the 500 megawatts being the size of Denver all at once in one place, like basically to a single outlet. Again, I'm oversimplifying it, but just think of your own home. And it's a really tricky problem. This is where grid operators are really trying to balance, where they know there's this increasing demand, but their job is to make sure the grid doesn't black out. And you got to take your time to make sure you're not going to do that. It's really advanced science. It's a lot of physics modeling. So you can't cut the corners, but the demand is going up. And I think that's what everyone is trying to solve for.
With the demand for power going up, and we hear constantly on the news again, like what Jairus was saying, of how much power and everything that the data centers and everything are taking, just not holding you to any of this, just your opinion. Where do you think it fails first? Do you think we don't put the right infrastructure in getting the lines to be able to interconnect these things? Do you think it's the power generation itself? Do you think it's the energy dance that everybody's doing between fossil fuels and renewables? Like, where do you see the biggest fail point, and where do you see the biggest opportunity?
So to me, the biggest, it goes hand in hand. And like the biggest, I'd just say question mark, because it's both an opportunity and where it could all go very sideways, is just what I call the who foots the bill at scale problem. And so what I mean by this is, so like right now, for example, we're all aware the OpenAIs, the Anthropics, like they're burning cash left and right.
Absolutely.
And they have a whole lot of infrastructure to build to get to like the actual supply of compute that they need. And they're already burning a ton of money. So it's heavily subsidized. So right now, basically, the private equity firms are footing the bill. But at a certain point, like you can't just burn tens and if not hundreds of billions of dollars. So then you have to pass that through pricing in theory. So then the consumer, it's like, okay, is the consumer really ready to basically offset these hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of cost? And if so, then it all kind of works. If not, well, then your demand goes down and then all of the needs of the data center companies go down and it moves upstream. And this whole foot the bill problem, like, we already know that they're burning cash, unlike literally any company in history.
Absolutely.
Then
You see that like the headline all the time. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Exactly. And then the part that I'd say is the biggest part when I talk to call it the tech groups or the people who might not be energy folks is the rate issue and the energy market side of this. So what I mean by that is it's already insanely expensive. But if you think about just classic supply and demand, right? So if I put Denver at one single point in the energy grid, and the energy grid is operated by energy markets and financial, what happens when demand spikes radically? Prices go up for everybody.
Yeah.
So then everyone in that town who is nearby this data center is saying, hold on, I don't want to foot the bill for this. Why is my utility bill going in? Like they can't opt out of that. Like if I don't want to use OpenAI, I don't have to log into OpenAI. But if there's a data center that all of a sudden makes my electricity bill go from $100 a month to $1,000, well, now I'm grumpy. So this is where you're starting to see some utilities dig their heels in. And I think this is what they should do this, because you otherwise don't have to opt out. Basically, these utilities are saying, hey, data center company, we'll let you plug in here. But if you spike the energy markets, you have to own the whole delta for everybody, this entire cost increase. And that so far has not been baked into the actual cost that's already really, really high for these data center companies. So that then exacerbates this problem of who foots the bill. So for me, like this opportunity / where it all goes wrong is if all of a sudden, okay, call it AI company X, you're saying you're going to build all this infrastructure, but the town is saying we're not footing the bill for these rate cases. So now the cost for this data center goes from here to here. And then that cost is so high when they try to pass that pricing through to the actual Chat GPT user, and a GPT user is like, I don't want to spend $50 to ask Google slightly better. Then all of a sudden, if that middle piece breaks down, all of these contracts for purchases of the data centers go down, and then you can kind of see how it spirals. So I'd say like the opportunity is if some financial wizard can figure out how to call it hedge that risk, there's a big play. But where it goes wrong is if all of a sudden, these commitments and these huge numbers you see, like someone's got to pay for it. And the math has seemed fuzzy to me. I would be honest at times.
The math ain't mathin'.
Yeah.
Yeah. It'd be a very expensive Google search, as I get, and again, there's a ton of use cases for AI outside of ChatGPTs, especially in like the software development world.
For sure.
We use them all the time, but you need a lot of big use cases in order to offset not only the bill just for the infrastructure, but especially once you start bringing in these energy costs that have not been really baked in yet.
I know we've got a lot of people who do follow this show and listen and pay attention. Being in like the energy space on an oil and gas perspective, understanding that the grid is likely not going to be able to meet all of the power, at least immediate power demands that these data centers are going to require, people are looking at behind the meter power generation fueled by natural gas. And I know we've got people in the audience and people who we talk to who are really curious on that, who are speculative, who may even be thinking about making some investments or moves on that space. What are things that they ought to keep in mind that they may not immediately be aware of? And then also on top of that, like what are things that your software, your service provides that perhaps they could take advantage of that they haven't thought of yet?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll take those, one by one. I think the biggest thing for me is anyone considering investments in that space in general is like any gold rush. I'm always let's take your time with the gold rush. If the gold rush is real and it's big enough, and especially with this AI one where, the headlines you hear is like, this is the biggest revolution ever. Right. If that is truly true, it's not a 2-year time window. So I would sort of say, don't let your investment get ahead of your guarantees on the other side. And I would say that'd be my caution too, to the open AIs and the Anthropics and the AWSs. They don't care about my opinion, but when I look at it, I'm just like, I don't know that you've solved this economic problem that seems like it's coming down the curve. So I'd say, but at the same time, certain things are committed. So if you've got, hey, if I'm a pipeline developer, there's a project that's underway, it's gotten all the approvals from the grid and it's happening, like, yeah, go make that investment and get it because there's real money. And yeah, I mean, a part of our platform, we'll talk about it in a second, is, how do you connect these natural gases to these data centers? So to me, I think the biggest thing to be curious is just don't try to get ahead of the wave. Like ride the wave, follow the wave, but just because you're seeing these big headlines that OpenAI is going to, build 5 gigawatts all over, and I wouldn't, if it was my checkbook, wouldn't be trying to get ahead of them getting ahead because you're already seeing some of these contracts go sideways. Does that kind of make sense of where I'm going?
That definitely
love
does.
It.
And then on the second piece of that of where does our software come in? That's a big part of what we do. And that kind of goes to that triangle is, if you're on that oil and gas side, like there's data centers being developed all over. And a big part of it is we absolutely have all sorts of pipeline infrastructure mapping in it so that you can make sure that you're triangulating between the two. I'd say, every project that is actively in development at any time and has times where it can go sideways. So, understanding where your infrastructure is and where potential projects are, or even just saying, hey, I maybe want to find some potential opportunities to pass to, a land management company who can then pass it to a developer. We can really triangulate that. We absolutely help companies really in all spheres of it. And I think this data center one is interesting because, like we've said, none of the 3 kind of core user bases we see really know the whole puzzle. And that's kind of the playbook we can give them is like, hey, here's how you do it. We have all of the pieces. But yeah, all that oil and gas infrastructure, data center locations, grid infrastructure, all of that is in there. And I tend to believe, and I appreciate your kind words, Jairus, that, we try to make it pretty easy to use to, cover any of those gaps in knowledge.
That's awesome. It's so important to have the right software, and I mean, we talk about that all the time, whether it be land management software or just, I mean, an AI software. Any one of these, to be able to have one that has a strong user interface that's easy to navigate, fantastic. So kudos to you for being able to put that off. I only have a couple more questions for you. One being, again, with that landman audience that's listening,
Yeah.
with your experience of what you've gone through kind of in that solar space, what would be something that a landman might not expect if he transitioned over and he was doing some solar deals? What have you seen in your history of working with this that you think would be something that would absolutely just like take him off guard a bit?
Great question. And this is maybe like a non-answer to the answer, but kind of like we talk to a lot of those types of folks. And I'd say one of the most common things we hear is like, it's in a way more similar than different. And I think that because, there's sort of the two sides of the table and, there's this sort of contention over the different times of like all of the arguments, where, whatever it may be, but like, it's still a pretty similar ball game. And I think that what I've always sort of found in energy, and I'll be the first to admit, like, I'm a pro renewables guy. Like, I think anyone that knows energy, and my co-founder, who's my cousin, is one of the best examples of this. Like, he wrote his whole PhD thesis on, how do you bring storage into the grid? How do you balance it? But anyone who really knows the grid will be the first to tell you, like, there is no one magic silver bullet. Like, to get where we're trying to go, especially with the data centers and the load growth, like, you kind of need it all. So I think that this idea of just the kind of at odds of like renewables versus traditional, which I think, you go to various conferences, and if you're at a purely renewables one, you'll get some pot shots at oil and gas. If you're oil and gas, they'll kind of throw
Oh, for
pot shots at
sure.
other. Like, it's more similar, and like the real answer to talk to the people who like know that the true grid the best is like, it's really
Yeah.
all of mix of all of it. And yeah, I mean, I know a lot of oil and gas people that have jumped. I know renewable companies that have had to do some oil and gas to do it. So I'm kind of of the belief it's like all one team, and the grid is in a really tricky spot that we
Yeah.
all kind of have to get solved, especially if this AI stuff is real. And
Yeah.
if we don't solve it, the AI stuff will likely not become as real as it probably seems today.
Hmm. I think that's that's a super important point. And like you explained it really well. And Jairus and I have gone to enough conferences, and we have heard all the way from the beginning of our background's very much upstream oil and gas. And from the beginning of hearing about like when the new renewables were coming into the space, I mean, we got hit over the head of people doing presentations of being like, it'll never replace it. Like the replace word was in there all the time. It's out here to replace us. We've gotta put some, guardrails up. And I think what's been so fun, and especially in the conferences that Jairus and I have gone to, and how we hear the tone change, and also the narrative that Jairus and I are able to put out and be able to put out with this platform. It's a combined effort of all of us to be able to help kind of raise the waters for everybody. And I really appreciate you saying that, because that's what we've definitely heard such a change on, and it's a combined platter of so many very expert minds for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And to me, it's sort of like being honest about the pros and cons of all. Like, I think
Yeah.
it's like, well, and I'll just see like in the media, or example, the call it renewables haters or stuff, or just like, oh, it's like subsidized to death. And I'm like, solar is the cheapest electron at utility scale. Just full stop.
Yeah.
Unsubsidized, it is the cheapest. Renewables are non-dispatchable. Full stop. Doesn't work at night. Like, so it's like until everyone can kind of get honest about where the pros and cons are, it's all silly. But like when you actually talk to the people in the space, I think everyone is pretty aware of that. And again, with your land management audience, who's a little more, call it land versus just capital E energy or capital
Right.
G grid, I think that's where the energy folks, I'd say, are all pretty aware of that. And to the degree all of the periphery of it can kind of get on that same page, I think it helps everyone where, that's kind of what we need for the grid to operate.
Help us all succeed. That's right.
Indeed. Yes.
I'm not calling anybody out by name, but I remember going to some really big oil and gas conferences and hearing some really big executives just absolutely throw all sorts of shade at like electric vehicles whenever they first came out, like when they first came out. And they're
Yeah.
they hated the Teslas. And they won't admit it now. They hated the
I
Teslas.
hated it.
And
100%.
they didn't want anything to do with it. And they would stand on a stage, like in front of the podium, and they just talk absolute, just hot mess on them. And then you cut to today, and those same, and I know it for a fact, of those same CEOs are driving like the EVs,
Right.
and they're like, this one's the one that can do the plaid, and it's like super fast. And like, oh, how the times have changed for sure. So I love that. Love that we're at this stage where we're all evolving. I'm super, super thankful to have been able to come into this space whenever it had more conflict, and to now be able to see people like yourself who are helping like spread that real positive message with it, and doing it in a way to where they're bringing everybody together. So, I mean, hats off to you. You're doing a great job.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we're doing our best. Yeah, I mean, I remember even too, like, pretty early days customer. It's probably, and I can't say the name, just one of the very big ones that, all of the ONGs when we first started were building out renewable arms. Because again, cheapest form of energy, the people that are truly in energy kind of know it's everything. And, we definitely had some conversations with some of our staff, like, oh, that's the Death Star, if you will, in certain terms. And we're like, no, like, you can't be pro renewables, but then not try to help people that are trying to get into it. You can't just be like, no, because you did other things that are different,
right.
like things change. So yeah. And again, I will be the first to admit, like, I am a pro renewable energy first. I think, if I were to pick, like, I do think the base load in the future probably is that, but the dispatchability piece and some of the natural pipeline and some of these really large scale assets right now, like, there's absolutely a need. And peaker plants, like, there is a case for all things, and it's like applying them to where they each play the best. And if there's one thing I've learned from this, which is why I caveat it all the top, is the energy industry is notoriously really hard to predict. I was at a conference called a year ago. I was did a talk, and it was a bunch of like utility execs. And one of them, and I was joking after, and he's like, who would have thought in 2018 we'd have been here, in 2025 at the time, really arguing about how do we handle all of this spiking demand for natural gas? And he's like, if you'd have told me that in 2018, I'd have laughed you out of this room. And I'm like, yeah, it's so who knows? And that comes to this data center thing. And back to your question, Jairus, about like, what would I tell anyone of your audience that's thinking about this data center game, getting into it again, is I'm a big believer, like, riding macro trends as a business owner, a business person is the right way. But if you get too far ahead of a wave, like, it can crash on your head. And I do think there are still question marks about what this really shakes out to be when the private equity companies don't want to burn hundreds of billions of dollars over every couple of years. So don't get too far ahead, but for the demand that's right there, like, go capture that opportunity that's sitting at everyone's feet.
Yeah. That is awesome. I came into this discussion hoping that we were going to be able to get your story about, having an idea, creating a business, being able to see that business get bought, and then seeing it flourish underneath a larger organizations. We don't have time for that today, so we're going to have to do a part 2, because I think people would be fascinated by that as well. But the points that we were able to talk about today are, very timely, very important, and just super, super interesting. So thank you so much for joining us and sharing your knowledge, not only on the software side, but also the perceptions and the opinions and the insights that you've been able to gain from people who are actively using your service and your product.
I'd say the short answer to your question, though, is like, it's so business school 101, but like, if you find a problem and if you're trying to start a company, just ask people what they dislike about their job and then build them something that fixes it. People really like to complain about their jobs. So that honestly was all we did. And we just kept saying, like, what stinks about your job? And then we were like, we fixed it. How about, will you buy it? It really is that, but would love to go in deep on a part 2.
That'd be fantastic. We absolutely want to have you back. And Jake, for the people that are interested and they enjoyed what you talked about today, what's the best way to learn more about you, learn more about PV Case, and just be able to connect with you if they need to?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few ways. So email is always a really good one. So my email is jake@pvcase.com. So that's Peter Victor Case, like briefcase.com. Our website is pvcase.com if you just want to see more about the company. You can also find me on LinkedIn, of course. And so any of those options, please reach out. I'd be happy to chat at any time. Jairus and Drew, we're both, I think, all three of us are connected on LinkedIn. So feel free to, dive into Drew and Jairus's connections, and I'm in there somewhere too. Again, really appreciate you guys having me on.
We had a blast. So for Drew Hopkins, for Jairus Johnson, for Jake Anderson, for all the noodlers out there, thank you again for listening to the Real Deal Landman Show, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.